We're the only major country that cannot be invaded on land. The Canadians are probably not going to get that angry, and the Mexicans couldn't organize one.
For the full recording and much more, go to geopoliticalfutures.com/ClubGPF.
So when we look at the situation, we got into World War I when the German U-boats began sinking ships. We got into World War II when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor and the Germans declared war on us, which was a bad move. And when we really think about the United States and the Cold War, it had a great deal more to do with the control of the Atlantic than people give credit for. This was not just an ideological, moral issue. We did not want the Russians at Cherbourg or at Bremenhaven. We did not want the Russians in the Atlantic. The Russians forced their way into the Atlantic at some point through what was called the Geo Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. We built a massive system for detecting Russian submarines, Soviet submarines, called Certas, and so on. We are safe so long as we command the seas. But most importantly, we also have the option of retreating behind the seas. So the idea that we have to be involved in the Eastern Hemisphere as a moral imperative, well, that's not how geopolitics works. We have options. We have those options only so long as we maintain domination, command of the sea. I studied Admiral Mahan, and he taught me that in his book, and he was absolutely right. And he's the great American strategist. So when we talk about strategy, I tend to talk more about imperatives. I see strategy as what must be done, okay? So the foundation of strategy is necessity. The necessity gives you a goal, and the goal gives you a strategy that you may follow, okay? So the difference between my approach is I am not oriented toward making policies. I'm oriented to finding out the imperatives nations have. So from my point of view, the Russians invading Ukraine, as many of you know, was an imperative. The northern border of Ukraine was several hundred miles from Moscow. That was untenable from the Russian point of view. You could predict what was going to happen, and we did. And in the same way, we can predict that it'd be very difficult for the United States to allow Taiwan to fall into Chinese hands because the gap between Japan and the Philippines would be very large. Right now, we're in a very good position in a maritime way. They have some narrow passages that we could manage. One thing to look at that I'd like to discuss is technology. I'm not sure that naval vessels at this point with drones and so on and so forth are not too vulnerable to attack. I wonder whether new technology means a new definition of strategy of controlling the seas. Not that that principle will ever end for the United States. From my point of view, what I'm seeing on land with precision strikes on satellite delivered targets is quite effective.
George, this question's for you from Garrett. Given the current global instability and the critical role of maritime superiority in maintaining U.S. geopolitical power, do you believe the United States is likely to face a major war within the next decade? And how does the need to reassert maritime dominance factor into your cyclical framework and your assessment of potential U.S. involvement in the next 10 years?
Well, it's very hard to imagine the United States able to get involved in a major, a really transformative war in the Eastern Hemisphere, that it would. I find it very difficult to believe any Eastern Hemispheric power could wage war in the continent of the United States. And that's not possible. If we have wars, there'll be naval and air wars somewhere in the Atlantic or the Pacific approaching their country. In other words, there will be wars. There'll be wars, the largest of which was Vietnam, which was tragic, but not that massive a diversion of capabilities. But the ability to make war on the United States, except with missiles and so on, in the United States is limited. The interest of the United States in engaging at this point in the Eastern Hemisphere, except in very particular circumstances, not a broad war, is also limited. So the next 10 years, it's hard to imagine, from my point of view, for example, a Chinese assault on the Pacific is conceivable, unlikely, but a Chinese assault on the United States. So in other words, the imperatives and the capabilities for waging war in this circumstance, the American imperative is not there in general. And the capability of the enemy to come that close to wage war in the United States is very limited. So I think the naval dimension is the most likely dimension of war, coupled with an air dimension, has to be the central focus, because that is the only possible sort of war, I think. That's significant war, I should say.